I thought it would be interesting to talk about marriage today, specifically what the Old Testament has to say about it. And for our Old Testament reading, we heard a passage from Genesis chapter 2, and that is what traditionally has been seen in Christianity as the basis for marriage. Now remember, God had created the world and everything in it, and then He created Adam. And God looked around at all the other living things He had created, and He realized that there was no suitable companion for Adam. And so God decided to create a companion from Adam. And it says that God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and He took a rib out of Adam, and from this rib fashioned a helper and companion for Adam. And this Adam called woman. And it says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And that has traditionally been interpreted within Christianity as the bedrock basis of marriage. Now there's something interesting about that verse. The phrase, a man shall cling to his wife, literally is not a man shall cling to his wife. It's a man shall cling to his woman. Now, wife is simply a product of translation into English. In the original language of the Bible, there is no word for wife, and there is no word for husband. Nowhere. Everywhere in the Bible, Old and New Testament, when you see the word wife or husband, it is a translation of his woman or her man. So there is not a separate word for wife or husband in the Bible. And this right here is a profound thing, I think, for Christian marriage. A woman has her man, a man has his woman, and it's a pairing off. Now I want to go back to the account in Genesis 2 where God saw that it was not good for Adam to be alone. And it says that God caused Adam to fall into a sleep, took a rib out, and made Eve. And now, he said, Adam says, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now, although the scripture itself only says that God took a rib out of Adam to make the woman, when Adam is talking and he said, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, that seems to indicate by that construction there that not only was a rib taken from Adam and the woman made, but flesh was also taken from Adam and a woman made. And biblical scholars tend to interpret this, or they did in the past, to mean that neither a man nor a woman is whole separately. A man and a woman are two parts that fit together to make a whole. And the reason they say that is because part of Adam was taken out to make Eve. And after something was taken out of Adam to make Eve, something was missing from him. He was somehow incomplete. And since the woman was made just from part of Adam, she is somehow incomplete too. Both woman and man separately are incomplete when they cleave together and become one flesh. Traditionally, that has been interpreted to mean that when the man and woman are together, they are both whole. Together, they are whole. Apart, they are separate. They cleave together and become one flesh. They are, in a sense, reunited to what Adam was before God took part of Adam out and made Eve. Now, that is seen as the biblical basis for the attraction between a man and a woman. That's what happens naturally when a man and woman pair off. They form a whole, one flesh, complete. Now, after having said that, it's interesting that in the Old Testament, pairing off does not mean just one and one. There are numerous times in the Old Testament where we see people who had multiple wives. Jacob, David, Solomon, Gideon, just to name a few. Some had many, many wives at the same time. The Bible doesn't tell us how many wives Gideon has, but it tells us he had 70 sons. Doesn't tell us how many daughters he had. So obviously he had more than one wife. He had to have a number of wives to have had 70 just sons. Solomon holds the record as far as we know for number of wives. The Bible says that he has 700 wives. And it's interesting that when the Bible talks about these multiple wives, it doesn't comment on them one way or the other. It doesn't advocate it, but neither does it condemn it. It's just presented as fact. Many men apparently had multiple wives back then, and it apparently was not seen to be wrong. Now, of course, the question arises whether women had more than one husband back then. Well, the Bible doesn't mention that. The Bible is silent on that. It's possible that they did. You know, if you think about it, if you look at the gender distribution in the United States or anywhere, it's about 50-50. Half the people are men, half the people are women. And you see, if every man had 3 or 4 wives, you'd run out of women. I mean, there simply wouldn't be enough women around to give every man 3 or 4 wives. And so you can say that either one of two things was going on. Either men had multiple wives and women had multiple husbands, or this custom of having more than one wife was limited to a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. Because if it wasn't, there wouldn't be enough women to go around. So we do not know which it was. Was this practice of having multiple wives just limited to just a handful of people? Or did men have multiple wives and women have multiple husbands, and it was just a big, one big happy family type of thing? We just don't know that. So, related to this issue, though, is also something else that's in the New Testament. It's the issue of concubines. And concubines are also common in the Old Testament. The people that we talked about earlier that have multiple wives. Abraham, Jacob, David, Gideon, Solomon, all these had concubines in addition to their wives. Now, a concubine is a woman a man has sex with, but he's not married to her, and she's not his wife. Now, in the Old Testament, sometimes we see concubines as living in the household with the man and bearing children for him. And other times we see the concubines do not live in the household and do not bear children. You know, it's sort of like what we call having an affair this day and time, but it was done out in the open. And interestingly, the Old Testament does not condemn this either. Now, as Solomon was said to have the record number of wives, he was also said to have the record number of concubines. He had 300. So between his wives and his concubines, he had 1,000 women. Now, the question arises here. Did women have concubines of men? And obviously, we're going to have to say that unless this practice of having concubines was limited to a tiny, tiny fraction of society, we would have to say that women would have had to have had concubines also, because you'd run out of women. You know, if Solomon had 1,000 women and Gideon had 50 and this guy over here's got 70, you know, you can't find that many women. We just don't know. Now, I wanted to talk for a minute about what part love played in marriage back then. A lot of times people will tell you that love played no part in marriage in Old Testament times, and they will tell you that marriages were arranged by the parents. And a lot of times they would say that maybe when a boy was 4 or 5 years old, his parents would go searching for a similar age girl around, 4 or 5 years old, and they'd make a deal with the parents that when our boy grows up and your girl grows up, they're going to get married. And these marriages were supposedly arranged for practical reasons, like for land expansion or keeping land in a family or making some kind of alliances between families or practical reasons, and love played no part. Now, the Old Testament does contain accounts of arranged marriages. Probably the best known one is the account of Isaac and his wife Rebekah. It's found in the book of Genesis. Remember, Isaac was the son of Abraham, and Abraham was living in a foreign land, and Isaac was getting to be the age of marriage, and Abraham didn't want him to marry a foreign woman where they were then, and so he sent one of his servants back to their homeland to find a suitable wife for Isaac. And the servant chose a girl named Rebekah. And the servant goes, Abraham's servant goes to Rebekah's family. He says, Abraham wants Rebekah to marry Isaac. And apparently they didn't know anything about Abraham other than he was rich, and that apparently was enough. And so Rachel agrees to the marriage, and she goes back with the servant, and she marries Isaac the same day she meets him. And I find it interesting that it says that Isaac loved Rebekah. He just met her and he fell in love with her. Now, in other places, though, the Old Testament does talk about marriages based on love. And this is seen in the account of Jacob and Rachel. Jacob, remember, was Isaac's son. And the Bible tells us that Jacob sees this girl, her name's Rachel, and he wants to marry her. He thinks she's beautiful, and he falls in love with her. So he goes to Rachel's father, a man named Laban, and he said, I want to marry Rachel. And Laban says, well, if you'll work for me for 7 years, I'll let you marry Rachel. So Jacob agrees. He works for Laban for 7 years, and then 7 years is up, and he goes to Laban, and he says, I've worked my 7 years, I want to marry Rachel. And Laban says, okay. But he tricks Jacob into marrying Rachel's sister, Leah, instead. And so Jacob finds out about it, and he's mad, and he goes to Laban, and he said, you tricked me. And Laban said, well, yeah, I did, but if you'll work another 7 years, you can marry Rachel. And that's what he does. He works another 7 years, and he's got his 2 sisters now are his wives. You can imagine how happy that household must have been. But now, this about Jacob's wives tells us something else about marriage in Old Testament times. Marriages within the same family were apparently common. Jacob and Rachel were first cousins, and they married each other. Now, Jacob's father, Isaac, had also married a cousin, and Abraham married his half-sister. And so marriage among close family members was not considered abnormal in Old Testament times. And also a thing I find interesting is that marriage was not in any way seen to be a religious thing. There does not appear to have been any kind of religious connotations for marriage. No kind of religious ceremony at all. The only kind of basic ceremonies that we see associated with marriage in the Old Testament is that it apparently is a feast, and then the couple have sex, and they are considered married. And we see that in the account of Jacob marrying Rachel's sister Leah. Remember, he thought he was going to get to marry Rachel. He went to Laban, and he said, okay, I'll let you marry her. Well, what it says happened was that Laban threw a big feast. And here's what it said. Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob. And Jacob went in unto her. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Now see, it was dark, and apparently Laban had sent Leah Rachel's sister, into the tent to have sex with Jacob instead of Rachel, and it was so dark he couldn't tell the difference. But in the morning, he figured out, well, I've had sex with her now, I've married her. He didn't even intend to. But remember that he eventually got Rachel too. Now, even though marriage was not seen as a religious ceremony in any way, the sanctity of a marriage was seen as a religious law. Adultery, of course, is a prohibition in the Ten Commandments. We find that. And in Hebrew society, adultery was considered a very serious thing. It was punishable by death. If you got caught committing adultery, you were killed by stoning, and stoning was a horrible way to die. And so adultery was seen as something extremely serious and absolutely prohibited. It's interesting, though, that having a concubine was not seen as adultery. You know, even though this man was married to another woman or other women and had sex with this woman over here who was a concubine, that was not considered adultery. So we might ask, well, how was the line drawn between just a concubine and having an affair? The Bible does not outline what the relationship of a concubine was, how it was established, or how long it lasted, or anything like that. And frankly, in no place in the historical literature do we find an exact description of the particulars of a concubine. Most of the stuff you hear about concubines is people's assumptions. In the ancient world, we do not know much about the particulars of a concubine. We know that men sometimes had sex with women other than their wives, and these were called concubines. They had some sort of relationship with these women, but we don't know anything about the particulars of it. Now, I think the important thing to take from all this is that in the New Testament, the concept of a man having just one wife for the rest of his life and having sex with no one else was apparently not the norm in the Old Testament. You could have multiple wives as well as multiple concubines. Now, what about divorce in the Old Testament? Well, here's what it says in Deuteronomy. When a man has taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her out a bill of divorcement and give it to her and send her out of his house. When she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. If the latter husband hates her and writes her a bill of divorcement and gives it to her and sends her out of his house, or if he should die, which took her to be his wife again, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. In other words, divorce is allowed. You simply write out, say, I'm divorcing you, and give it to them and kick them out. Interesting, if she goes out and marries another man, and then he divorces her or dies, and she comes back to you, you can't marry her again. And biblical scholars surmise that that happened because there was a problem with men divorcing their wives on a whim and then later wanting them back. Now, this seems like an easy way of getting a divorce, but there were certain conditions in the Old Testament under which divorce was prohibited. If a man married a woman and claimed she was not a virgin, then if that was found to be false, then he could never divorce her. However, she could divorce him if he accused her of not being a virgin and it was found to be that she was. Now, another instance where divorce is not found is found in Deuteronomy. If a man rapes a woman who is engaged to another man, the penalty was death for both. In other words, if a man rapes a woman who is engaged to be married to another man, both of them are put to death. And the reason for that was that it is assumed that if the woman had not wanted to have sex, that she would have screamed and someone would have come to her rescue. So technically this is not seen as rape, but adultery. In the Bible, when someone was engaged, that's when the prohibition against adultery came into effect. You didn't have to be married to someone else to commit adultery. You could just be engaged to someone else, and that was seen as adultery. However, if a man rapes a woman who is not engaged to another man, then the penalty for that is not death. He simply has to pay a sum of money to her father, and then he has to marry her, and he can never divorce her. So those are the situations in which divorce is prohibited in the Old Testament. Now, this harkens back to what we saw with Jacob and Leah and Rachel. Remember, Jacob went in and had sex with Leah and didn't find out it was her till the next morning, and he was already married to her. And so basically what you would see that consummated the marriage and made it was them having sex together. And in this law about a man raping an unengaged woman, we see that him having sex with her was tantamount to him marrying her. However, this does not necessarily mean every time that if you had sex with someone you were considered married to them. There are many instances in the Old Testament where people had sex but were not considered married and were not required to marry. And so while sex may have been the thing that consummated the marriage or signed your name on the marriage certificate, just because you had sex with someone did not always necessarily mean you were considered to be married. Now, what this law about the difference between raping an engaged woman and a non-engaged woman does illustrate, as I said, is the fact that when you became engaged, you were for all practical purposes considered to be married. When you were engaged, you were not living together. And a lot of times, a boy and girl could be engaged to each other and never had met each other. But in the eyes of society, they were as good as married, and their marriage would not be consummated until they got older and had sex, but they were seen as belonging to each other from the moment that their parents had decided upon the engagement. Now, there is another kind of marriage in the Old Testament that I wanted to talk about, and this is called levirate marriage. And this comes into effect if you have a brother who gets married and he dies before he is able to produce a child with his wife. You are encouraged to take that woman as one of your wives and raise children up for your brother. Now, you were not forced to do that, but it was strongly encouraged. And I wanted to read you this passage from the book of Deuteronomy so you can see how much it was encouraged. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let the wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house, and his name shall be called the house of him who had his sandal removed. And so, although, they're not going to force you to do this, if you don't want to take your brother's widow as one of your wives and raise up sons for your brother, she's going to come in front of everybody and take your sandal off and spit in your face, and this will be a public shaming. Now, this kind of levirate marriage was apparently still practiced in the New Testament because we do see it referred to in the New Testament. So that's an overview of marriage in the Old Testament. And, you may be surprised to find how little there is about marriage in there. It's not a lot. You would have expected to have this whole big treatises about marriage and all this and the other, but it's not in there. So what we did see, just as an overview, we saw how marriage was not considered to be a religious thing. There's no indication that any kind of priest or religious official performed any kind of marriage ceremony. Now, we saw how sometimes marriage was based on love. You fell in love and married somebody, but many times it was based on practical reasons, and it wasn't uncommon back then to be engaged to be married to some girl when you were 4 or 5 years old and had never met them. Now, we saw how marriage within a family was common. We saw first cousins. We saw half-brothers and sisters getting married. We saw how it was so common, among at least some people, to have multiple wives and have women in addition to that with whom you had some kind of relationship with and sex with. And so we saw how marriage was not a religious thing, but the sanctity of marriage was a religious thing. While the marriage itself was not religious, the sanctity of that marriage was a religious thing, because the Hebrew religion prohibited adultery, and the penalty for adultery was death. Now, we saw that except in a few special exceptional cases, divorce was fairly easy in the Old Testament times. All you had to do was write out a divorce and give it to them, and they were gone, and women could do the same. And finally, we saw the concept of levirate marriage, where if your brother died before producing children, you were obligated to marry his widow, and those children would be considered his. And if you did not do that, you would be subject to real public humiliation. So, like I said, I don't know about you, but it sort of surprises me that in the Old Testament, which is like 3/4 of the Bible, if you look at it lengthwise, that's about all there is about marriage.